Would you have watched a race that featured 20 clones of the same car? That was the exact situation of the IMSA back in the early 80s. The Porsche 935 was a monument to German engineering. It was based on the 911 Turbo, but it had been pushed to the absolute limit of the rules. It used a massive flat-six engine, using a mix of air and water cooling to handle its immense power, often producing over 700 horsepower. It was reliable, it was expensive, and it was seemingly unbeatable. For any other manufacturer to enter the top-tier GTX class, they had to accept a simple reality. You were playing in Porsche's backyard, and you were likely going to lose. At the exact same time, the Ford Motor Company was facing a different kind of pressure. The 1970s had been difficult for Detroit. The fuel crisis and tightening emissions regulations had turned the American muscle car into a shadow of its former self. The Mustang specifically had spent years as the Mustang II, a car that was commercially successful but lacked any real performance. In 1979, Ford launched the Fox Body Mustang. This was meant to be a fresh start, but a fresh start requires a proof of concept. Ford needed a way to tell the public that the Mustang was once again a serious performance machine. The logic of the era suggested that Ford would build a massive V8, put it in a tube chassis car that looked vaguely like a Mustang, and try to outmuscle the Germans. That is what the fans expected, and it is what the competition expected. But Ford chose a path that, at the time, seemed like the worst mistake they'd ever do. When Ford decided to challenge Porsche in the GTX class, they didn't go to their traditional engine builders in Michigan. Instead, they looked across the Atlantic to a small German tuning house called Zakspeed. Zakspeed was famous for their success in the Deutsche Rennsport-Meisterschaft, or DRM. They had been racing Ford Capri with incredible success, but the engine they were using was not a V8, it was a four-cylinder. When the Zakspeed Mustang arrived on the North American racing scene in 1981, the technical specifications were met with genuine confusion. Beneath the wide, aggressive bodywork sat a four-cylinder engine that started at just 1.4 litres. To put that in perspective, the Porsche 935s it was competing against had engines more than double that size. The engine was based on the Cosworth BDA architecture, a design that had its roots in economy cars. However, Zakspeed had fitted it with two overhead camshafts, 16 valves, and a massive turbocharger. On paper, it seemed like a mathematical mistake. In a sport where displacement is king was the unofficial motto of the American paddock, Ford was showing up with a motor that had less volume than a large bottle of soda. The engineering trade-off here was weight and packaging. A V8 engine is heavy and occupies a significant amount of physical space. By using a tiny four-cylinder, Zakspeed could shove the engine further back in the chassis, creating a front-mid engine layout. This improved the centre of gravity and the polar moment of inertia. The small engine was capable of producing 600 horsepower. While that was less than the Porsches, the Mustang was significantly lighter. On a technical circuit, the theory was that the Mustang would be more agile, late braking, and efficient. But the paddock remained sceptical. A high-strung, small-displacement turbo was seen as a qualifying engine, something that could do one fast lap before the heat and pressure caused a catastrophic failure. Ford was betting their reputation on a car that looked like a Mustang, but sounded like a sewing machine. In the meantime, the IMSA had what was known as the silhouette rules. These rules were designed to let manufacturers race high-tech prototypes while keeping a visual link to the cars in the showroom. The Zakspeed Mustang shared almost nothing with the car you could buy at a dealership. The chassis was a space-frame design, a web of thin-wall steel tubing that provided immense rigidity while weighing very little. The body panels were made of Kevlar and carbon fibre, materials that were exotic and expensive for the early 80s. From a business perspective, the incentive for Ford was clear. They wanted to create a halo effect. If a car that looked like a Mustang was leading a Porsche 935, the customer at the Ford dealership might feel a sense of pride in their own road car, but there was a growing tension between the marketing department and the racing team. Marketing wanted the car to look exactly like a Mustang. Engineering wanted the car to win. The result was a compromise. The greenhouse, the pillars and the glass had to maintain the Mustang's profile. However, the rest of the car was an exercise in extreme aerodynamics. It had a massive front air dam to create downforce and an enormous rear wing to keep the light rear end planted. This created a strange visual contradiction. It was a Mustang that had been stretched, flattened, and widened until it looked more like a low-slung wedge than a pony car. Underneath that Kevlar skin, the cooling requirements for the tiny, high-boost engine were immense. The car was riddled with ducts and vents, each one a necessity to keep the engine from melting under the strain of over 50 pounds of boost during qualifying. Ford was building a whole new narrative. They were trying to prove that American performance didn't have to be big and heavy. It could be small and sophisticated. But as the 1981 season began, that narrative was about to be tested by the harsh reality of endurance racing. If you don't want to miss out on anything cars, make sure to subscribe. When the Zaxby's Mustang actually hit the track, the skepticism in the paddock vanished instantly. It wasn't just fast, it was terrifyingly fast. In its debut season, the car began out-qualifying the Porsche Works teams. At the 1981 IMSA race at Lime Rock, the Mustang took the pole position and won the race outright. It was a shock to everyone. A four-cylinder Ford had just outrun the best that Stuttgart had to offer. However, this speed came at a cost. The car was operating on the bleeding edge of what 1980s metallurgy could handle. The vibration from a high-revving four-cylinder is fundamentally different from the smooth power delivery of a flat six or a V8. This vibration acted like a slow-motion jackhammer, backing out bolts, cracking welds, and causing electrical gremlins. During the 1981 and 82 seasons, a pattern emerged. The Mustang would qualify at the front. It would lead the race, often pulling away from the Porsches with ease. And then it would break. A turbocharger would fail, a head gasket would let go, or the transmission would succumb to the torque. From a business standpoint, this created a dilemma. In racing, a car that is too fast for its own good is often seen as a failure of management. Ford was spending millions of dollars to lead 80% of a race, only to watch Porsche take the trophy at the finish line because their engines simply refused to die. The engineers at Zaxby's were constantly chasing reliability, but they were fighting physics. To get 600 horsepower out of these small engines, you have to run incredible amounts of boost. That boost creates heat. In an endurance race lasting up to 24 hours, heat is the ultimate enemy. The Mustang was a sprinter trying to run a marathon, and while it was the fastest sprinter in the world, the finish line was always just a few miles too far. By 1983, the landscape of sports car racing was shifting. IMSA moved toward the GTP, the Grand Touring Prototype class. These were no longer silhouettes based on road cars. They were purpose-built racing machines with ground effect aerodynamics. Ford decided to evolve. They moved from the front-engine Zaxby's Mustang to a mid-engine design called the Mustang GTP. This car was intended to be the ultimate expression of Ford's new world engine strategy. The business goal had shifted. Ford was no longer just trying to sell the Fox body Mustang. They were trying to market a new era of small displacement, turbocharged engines across their entire global lineup. The Mustang GTP used a 2.1-litre version of the Zaxby's four-cylinder. It was housed in a radical carbon fibre monocoque chassis, one of the first of its kind. But internal politics at Ford began to complicate the project. There was a rift between Ford of Europe, who had championed the small turbo engine, and Ford's US divisions, who were still protective of the V8's legacy. Additionally, the Mustang GTP was plagued by aerodynamic issues. The car produced so much downforce that it would literally begin to crush its own suspension components at high speed. The Mustang GTP managed a win in its very first race at Road America in 1983, but it was a fluke of weather and strategy rather than a display of dominance. For the rest of the season, the car was a nightmare of unreliability and handling problems. Then, quite suddenly, Ford pulled the plug. They walked away from the GTP program, leaving the Porsches to dominate the rest of the decade. To the outside observer, the entire ZAC Speed and GTP experiment looked like a massive, expensive failure. Ford had built the fastest cars on the grid, terrified the most successful racing team in history, and yet they had almost no trophies to show for it. The reason why Ford walked away, and why the ZAC Speed Mustang actually matters, is because of what was happening inside Ford's headquarters. While intended to win, the project served a greater purpose. It proved to Ford's leadership that a high-tech, small displacement future was possible. In the late 70s, Ford's leadership was navigating an internal culture that largely believed the V8 was the only way to build a performance car. The engineering teams knew that fuel economy standards and global competition meant they had to master turbocharging and small displacement efficiency. The ZAC Speed project acted as a strategic proof of concept. By taking a tiny four-cylinder engine and using it to terrify Porsche, by proving that it could outqualify and outrun the world's most sophisticated racing engines, the engineers demonstrated a high-performance alternative to their own board of directors. The failure of the car to win endurance races was secondary to the fact that it validated the potential of the technology. The ZAC Speed project acted as a catalyst that justified the marketing and development of the 1984 Mustang SVO. The SVO was a departure for Ford, a high-tech turbocharged four-cylinder Mustang with sophisticated suspension and aerodynamics. It represented the road-going application of the ZAC Speed philosophy. Without the terrifying speed of the race car to prove the viability of small displacement turbocharging, the SVO might never have been approved. The ZAC Speed Mustang didn't fail because of bad engineering. It reached the limits of the era's technology while fulfilling a specific strategic role. Once the company had committed to a future of global efficient engines, a shift that remains debated by literally everyone today. Because the V8 is still considered the best engine out there, the racing program had served its intended purpose. Don't forget to subscribe to not miss anything cars and business.